Welcome to the Ex Terra Podcast. The Ex Terra mission is to explore and discuss the business of space and its effect on the national and global economy, as well as life on Earth. How does what happens in space affect your life every day? That's what we're exploring on the Ex Terra website, as well as on this podcast. My guest is Jeff Crusey, who's a busy man by all accounts with the background to prove it. He's been a product manager, senior analyst at a VC, a company co-founder, a strategy manager at ViaSat, a VC with Sepharim Space, as well as an angel investor for space military manufacturing startups Epsilon 3 and True Anomaly. Jeff, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
So when do you sleep?
Honestly, not all that much. No, I shouldn't say that. I think my hobby is my work as well. So I spend a lot of time doing that, and it's something that harkens back to my early childhood, actually, when I used to have a lot of fun trying to find the latest and greatest in local music and seeing where that would blossom eventually. So it's only natural that my work sort of parallels that later in life.
Speaking of which, you've had a very varied career, and it's been focused mostly in the high-tech arena. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. I fell into it by mistake, actually. I did an undergraduate business program at Wharton, and my final class involved writing a business plan and pitching it to a VC. And I remember I had to redo it, and I swore I would never write another business plan or get involved in VC or anything like that for the rest of my life. And here I am. And it kind of happened by mistake, actually. I was early on after university, I was working at a small merchant bank, working on private placements and M&A, primarily in the biomedical fields. And I just naturally gravitated more towards the earlier stage businesses. And that was because I just seemed to have an interest in what was the latest or greatest and what could be and what our future might look like as a result. And so, in a weird turn of events, I decided that actually VC and startups were what I wanted to be more involved in. And I think I had sort of a little bit of altruism baked in there also, because I wanted to see the world become a better place. I know a lot of people say that, but I truly believe that. One of the ways we can improve the world around us is via technology. And if I knew a little bit about it, maybe that's how I could help out the larger ecosystem. So after that, I got into climate tech in sort of the 1.0 back in 2008, worked at a few different startups in semiconductors, AR, VR, AI, and eventually it came full circle with space, which actually intersected a lot of those previous areas, and fell into it by accident and had more to do with my curiosity around why Google and Facebook wanted to put balloons and drones up to spread connectivity all over the world, which didn't make sense in my mind, but I was very ignorant of that level of communication. So I ended up bugging the people over at ViaSat with questions for quite a while. And I think I bothered them so much, they just decided, fine, we'll give you a job if you'll leave us alone and you can figure it out for yourself.
I need to do that maybe. Or you can be like the two of us and as well, we'll just create our own job. Mike and I, when we started this company, say space commerce is like the early days of Silicon Valley in the late 1970s, early 1980s. Is that kind of a fair assessment? And if so, is the upside going to be similar?
I think it's hard to tell. I was asked a very similar question back in 2008 about climate tech. And I don't know that I felt as optimistic about climate tech, and that it would remain sort of a smaller portion of the larger energy industry, and that might be it, because of a lot of regulatory hurdles that might not, and political hurdles we might not be able to get beyond. In retrospect, I was completely wrong about that entirely, and it's come back in a huge way, and I'm happy for it, because I think it's one of the most important issues of our time. And if I'm looking at my previous pattern matching record, I would say, well, I could probably be wrong about space as well, in that maybe we're going to go through that valley, somewhat of a valley of death in the short term, because the funding environment has slowed down. There's less funding available for a lot of startups, but there are some tailwinds, which are great. Like, space commerce intersects defense so much, and with the current geopolitical climate, that could potentially provide a lot of non-dilutive early stage funding for more of those space commerce companies. That could also mean that the U.S. government, who is the largest customer typically in that segment, will be putting more money towards it. And I think also there are some trends in terms of sovereignty within different technological domains that space cuts across that are becoming more and more important, again, because of the geopolitical climate. So we could actually see more support than we typically would outside of these sort of exogenous trends. But
is space technology today more mature than that green technology was back in 2008? Are we ahead of the curve in space technology?
I think so, actually. There is, it's a fairly well-known quantum. We characterize the space environment pretty well thus far, and the proof of science isn't as high of a hurdle for space tech as I believe it was for climate tech back in 2008. Meaning, there's less inertia for those businesses moving forward. So it could very well ramp up a lot faster. Also, I mean, we're putting more and more infrastructure in orbit, don't necessarily need it on terrestrially on Earth. And that could also drive a lot of that. I mean, very rapidly, telecommunications is becoming a space business. And that can drive huge waves of innovation.
In fact, a lot of the market reports we look at show that the telecommunications aspect of it is what's driving the satellite industry right now. Between the satellite internet and satellite television, that is what is really giving a big boost to a lot of these satellite companies.
Absolutely agree with you there.
But and I want to just kind of dig into this for just a moment, because in my mind, and you can correct me if I'm wrong because I often am, but you look at solar technology now, windmills are basically doing the same thing that they did in Holland in the 1800s. They still generate energy out of wind. And it seems like the space technology is moving so much faster than that. It seems like every time you turn around, there's something new, whereas solar and wind, the advancements seem to have been way more incremental, whereas the space improvements have been exponential.
I would agree with you there. A big reason why is because, and I hope nobody digs on me for this, but there's this sort of the graybeard effect that a lot of people, younger engineers in space tech refer to, which is there's a great body of work that's been done, for the last few decades by folks that came out of sort of the Cold War era. And that became the standard. And it was a different design philosophy too. It was redundancy upon redundancy to assure that there was performance of whatever system you're putting up in orbit. That's changed a lot with the idea of launching things in the LEO, which makes it a bit more of a disposable than it was this thing that needed to remain in orbit for a decade or two. So I think that's one interesting aspect of it. And then that means that there's a larger upside to gain with respect to integrating newer technologies that weren't being designed in for the last few decades because of those dynamics I just described. So we can use, off-the-shelf components for a lot of these LEO satellites, faster chips, better sensors, and all of a sudden we see this, faster ramp than we'd normally see.
You look up graybeard in the dictionary, you'll find my picture, but That's neither here nor there.
I shouldn't talk, right? You can see it.
I was one of those kids who at 10 years old was up watching the first moon landing. So that kind of gives you an idea of my time frame in this business. Let's talk a little bit about some of these startup companies, because you do a lot of investing in space companies. What makes a startup successful? And then what are some of the most common mistakes that the founders of space companies make?
So one of the most interesting proxies I've found for successful space companies, and this isn't universally true, but I've seen it anecdotally quite a few times, which is some of the best space companies early on were very, very good at winning non-dilutive funding from government sources, specifically the US government. I think it's hard to argue that there would be a SpaceX without a lot of that kind of funding early on. And really taking advantage of that to go through that early R&D phase so that science and efficacy are proved before going out to investors is really, really important. And I think a leg up to a lot of those businesses as compared to others that just go out and try and raise venture capital for what is basically R&D at that point. So that is one good proxy for success of a lot of these companies that I've seen. One thing, and this is less related to the technology, and it's just something I broadly see across deep tech and specifically within space tech as well, which is there are a lot of competing forces for talent right now. SpaceX, Amazon, Microsoft, these are companies that can pay rather healthy, sums of money to people to go work for them. And then this is who a lot of startups are competing with. And what that translates to is really challenging hiring environments where it takes longer and costs a lot more than initially anticipated for a lot of these startups. And that can create reverberations in terms of financing down the road as well. And I think there's a big advantage to startups that figure out and understand that well early on, as compared to doing it on the fly, because that can allow you to bring in talent in a more timely fashion without having to pay, super high premium. And it's interesting because it's not exactly related to the technology or the business specifically, other than, this is the environment that they're in. And one of the ways I've seen a lot of early stage funds really actually provide value to their startups is helping them in this specific regard.
For those of us who don't live in that financial world, when you talk about undiluted capital, what does that mean?
Sure. Undiluted capital means it's capital that's going into the business that isn't buying a portion of the equity of that company. So if I invest in a company one day and then another investor comes in to buy more of it at a different valuation, that will reduce the size of my slice of the pie somewhat. And ultimately hoping that the pie is much bigger later on, but that does dilute down my shareholding. So non-dilutive funding often will come from government sources. There's some private grants that can be applied for as well. There's a lot more opportunities for those sorts of things. And I should flag that the SBIR program that the U.S. government has put forward across a number of their different agencies and branches of military has really been such a good support for a lot of these space tech companies.
You can tell I've watched just enough Shark Tank to be dangerous. but along those lines, does the money chase success? When you look at you said that there wouldn't be a SpaceX without investment, and everyone thinks, well, Elon Musk is a billionaire, he's self-financing all of this. Jeff Bezos, much the same way. He made his money with Amazon, and now he's got a rocket company. Do those kinds of companies find it easier to get people like you to invest in them because they've already been successful at something else?
I think a lot of VCs might agree with that statement. I like to use my counterintuition a little bit in that if that's the same pattern everybody's trying to match to, it's going to be a highly competitive company to invest in, and my probability of success as an investor might not be very high. I might get pushed out by a much larger investor, somebody that's got a bigger brand name, and therefore it's I want to find an area that I can't or I don't have to compete in as much. And there's not a lot of examples of successful space tech entrepreneurs just yet. We're very early on. So I don't think my intuition would be leading me well if that's the approach I tried to take. So what I try and look for are other qualities in founding teams that might give me a good indication of potential success. And that can take many different shapes or forms. But one of the ones that seems to be pretty consistent across all of these companies is that just deep technical experience in the field that they're involved in.
I'm talking with space investor Jeff Crusey on the Ex Terra Podcast. Take a moment right now to click on subscribe to be sure you don't miss an episode of the podcast, or if you're watching on YouTube, any of the videos from Ex Terra, the Journal of Space Commerce. Jeff, there are some disturbing trends that we're being faced with right now in population, declining population growth rates, the onset of inflation, governments, companies, and individuals with too much debt, and unfortunately, there's the war and the prospect of war. How do those kinds of issues affect investing these days, and particularly investing in the near future?
I think what's happening in Ukraine right now has actually highlighted some important areas that might have been neglected historically by the venture capital community. For a long time, investments have been skewed primarily towards enterprise SaaS, or software as a service, and consumer. And then I think the next largest category is healthcare. A very, very small sliver of the total investment stack has been dedicated towards issues like climate and energy sovereignty, which, like I said, in Ukraine, that's highlighted the need for that. So I think we're starting to see a new trend for investors turning their attention more towards what I would call like critical technologies that aren't, necessarily part of those three other categories that I just mentioned. And that also probably has to do with the fact that, because software has been eating the world for the last, couple of decades, as Mark Andreessen would say, it's become hyper competitive, and we've reached some limits there to what those applications can do. And it's time to turn our attention back to things like the hardware and the hard tech, which eventually begets a whole new set of applications. And I like to analogize it to the iPhone, actually. Whereas before we used to have these hard-coded keyboards and our BlackBerry phones and limited functionality. You couldn't have an Uber app on that phone, really. But along came iPhone with the touchscreen, which, a modification of the hardware there begat a whole new marketplace of applications. They started adding, better sensors to the phones, so you could do things like take much nicer pictures. All of a sudden, you didn't need a digital camera with you, and now you have all of these, photo-based social networks, and that exploded and created tons of value. So I think we're going through this new cycle of innovation, so that we can beget like a third wave almost.
Well, despite the kind of gloomy nature of the previous question, are you generally optimistic or are you pessimistic about the future?
It's funny because when I was younger, I was pretty pessimistic about the future. As I got a little bit older, I think I recognized it's sort of business as usual for humanity, and these are things that happen, as terrible as they are. One of the things I do believe in is many of these issues can be staved off by leveraging technology to achieve stability and resilience. I'll use an example. Folks at the CIA will tell you, they're not really that interested in like spy gadgets. They're more interested in fixing problems like food security in countries so that they don't erupt into civil war and create bad actors against the U.S. And all of a sudden, you start to see what's really more important and investable in the coming future, which is around technology to achieve that kind of stability and resilience that I was talking about, and why that's an area that I focus almost all my effort and time on.
How much hand-holding do you have to do? Because a lot of the folks that are starting up these companies are very smart people, but they're also rocket scientists, for lack of a better term, do they have the business sense that to make a company successful? And do you get involved at all with the companies in which you invest, helping them make a successful business?
One of the things I pride myself on is being one of those investors that actually does roll up their sleeves to support their businesses. And I think most of the companies that I worked with will attest to that. There are plenty of VCs out there that will say they do that, but are really just marketing off the back of the success of their funds or their startups that they invest in. So do I need to do a lot of hand-holding? It varies pretty widely, to be honest, because there are some of those stellar entrepreneurs out there that just, they come up learning curves so quickly. It doesn't take much effort to support them on, the operational and commercial side of things alongside, their deep technical expertise. Other times, sure, some entrepreneurs don't have that background and they need a bit of hand-holding. And that's not to say that, the founders are the end all be all of the survival of that business. So, there are times when, I do get very heavily involved, all the way down to, product development and co-development, and then as high as helping out with introductions into various governments and corporates that, could be potential customers. And then there are some of those businesses that don't need my help at all. And they've got better help than myself for their specific needs.
It does seem like there's a lot of money ready to invest in the right deals in space commerce. Is that a correct perception? And if it is, why is it happening now?
I think the why it's happening now comes back to that notion around software has been eating the world for the last few decades. Some of those areas I'd mentioned, like enterprise SaaS, have become hyper competitive. Another way to think about that is it's limited the return potential for investors. So they need to go look elsewhere for outsized returns. And that's typically what VCs are looking for. They're not looking for a company to grow, once or twice in terms of value. They want something that grows 10, 20 times in terms of value to justify the risk that they're taking for an investment. So coming back to, is there ample funding out there? There is what investors will refer to as a lot of dry powder or capital left to be deployed right now. And I think space has become very, very popular. I would say that largely has to do with SpaceX and Elon Musk generating, a large amount of interest in this category, but showing, and creating a real pathway to making economics actually work. And intuitively, there are a lot of things that we just can't do terrestrially that we can do with space tech at scale. And I think that's why we see such a large intersection between space and climate, for example, because if we're really needing to look at emissions of gas pipelines that are leaking, it's really hard to do that at scale with terrestrial cameras, even drones or planes. If we can do that, in very broadly using sensors in orbit, that all of a sudden makes the economics work much better. And so I expect that we'll continue to see plenty of investment in this area, especially if the largest customer, who's still the US government for the most part, is going to be spending much, much more money in this area tied to some of these challenges across geopolitics and climate that we've talked about, that in providing non-dilutive funding for that, then that's music to the ears of most investors.
Does the investment community understand space, or is it a fad, for lack of a better word, right now?
So it reminds me a lot of climate tech back in 2008, where it felt like a fad. There were a lot of people that had made money in enterprise software as a service that were interested in climate, largely driven by large sums of government money that were going towards it. And I didn't see a lot of skill set or industry experience at that point in time. That's changed dramatically since then. There are a lot more qualified scientists, people from the utility industry that are more heavily involved and have better credibility to help drive outcomes for startups that they invest in. I would say space is sort of in a similar point in which there are fewer people than I'd hoped with the serious background in space tech to go credibly invest in them. But there's nothing wrong with that. I think, it's a win-win. If I, again, use the climate tech analogy, back in 2008, from that period, there were some massive companies that were invested in and still exist today that really do move the needle for addressing climate. And similarly with space, I think we're sort of in this embryonic period where, there's a lot of money moving around and wealth, and it's primarily driven by interest. But as it matures, we'll see more and more folks that have the background in astrophysics and developing sensors and optics and antennas and propulsion systems, becoming more specialized, and especially on the investment side of things, and helping propel those businesses even more than they would have been, starting in 2018 or 19.
Along those lines, what areas of space commerce need startups right now? What is missing in the market?
So if you asked me a few months ago, I would have said on-orbit security. That's not something that's really existed to date. And I've been writing about it for a while, and I was lucky to see that a company called True Anomaly emerged, and they're often billed as the Andorra of space. So I would have said that, but I'm an angel investor in the company, and I have a lot of confidence that this particular team will be able to really meaningfully address that challenge. One of the things that I keep coming across that stands out to me is that we have lots of data that's being generated from the various Earth observation satellite constellations that are up there, optical, SAR, hyperspectral, thermal, and so on. And that's data that developers will use to build applications of various types. And the side of the application development that I see today harkens back to game development many years ago, where you would need a team of PhDs to develop a physics engine and the generative landscapes and all these sorts of things. And along came Unity and Unreal, these game development platforms that dramatically simplified all of that for people. So you didn't need a PhD to do that. You didn't even need to finish high school to go do that. And it became more accessible. Then all of a sudden we saw the market really grow in a meaningful way, because we could get out and iterate on applications much faster, meeting the needs of customers in a much more efficient fashion. And I think there's an analogy to draw with Earth observation data today, which is I'm seeing a lot of these teams develop custom environments, reinventing the wheel every time. It takes some very skilled and highly trained PhDs oftentimes to do this, data scientists as well. And it's just not very accessible. And it's also to say that it's not the end-all be-all for applications. I mean, there's obviously lots of other data sources that they'll potentially use in building these applications. So I think there's probably room for an Earth observation or geospatial data development platform that doesn't really exist today in a more coherent fashion, meaning, well, it's not just Earth observation data. There's also aerial, drone, sometimes you might want to use handset data. Maybe you source a lot of it from the internet and use it in different and interesting ways. And I don't think I see that today. And part of the challenge is, oftentimes you still have to pick up the phone and call the various data providers to get uptime over the area of interest, as well as historical data that matches that you can train models on. And it's just this very manual process right now, and it's not very automated. So I think, in the future, we'll probably see something like Unity or 3D and Unreal geospatial computing.
Which leads me into my final question, and that's to ask you to look out, if you will, over the next 10 to 15 years in space commerce and tell us what you see.
I think there's going to be a large push for lunar dominance. We're watching folks like China, make plans for a persistent presence up there, and the U.S. will need to respond to that in some way, shape, or form. And where I once thought the cislunar economy was just sort of a government-supported far-off bet, I think it'll be a much larger market than I had originally anticipated, and we'll start to see the early workings of that over the next decade with a sustained human presence.
So you think that commercial companies are going to be very, very involved in that lunar habitation?
Absolutely, because NASA is getting better and better at working with commercial companies to achieve all those ends, because it's such a huge project, and it would be very, very difficult to do that all by themselves. And it's not to say that they can't. They've done it in the past. They went to the moon before with a lot less technology. But if we can start to integrate external innovation more rapidly, we can achieve those goals in much shorter timelines than we would have been able to otherwise.
And I've seen a lot of folks in the last month or so talk about, well, we ought to just let Elon go to the moon because Artemis has had such a hard time getting off the launch pad. So, and I think we can just kind of leave that hang right there, Jeff.
Absolutely. I can't say I disagree.
Jeff Crusey, thanks so much for your time today. It's been an interesting discussion. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Tom.
That is going to do it for this edition of the Ex Terra Podcast. You can subscribe to the audio version of the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many other popular podcasting platforms. Be sure to click on subscribe so you don't miss an episode of the podcast or any of our other videos. You can also get daily space commerce news at xterrajsc.com. And one thing more, be sure to connect with us on LinkedIn and follow us on Twitter at xterrajsc. Until next time, I'm Tom Patton. Thanks for joining us.